Good afternoon. This is the Institute for Historical Study monthly presentation. My name is 𝘑𝘠𝘥𝘢𝘪𝘴𝘵, the Vice President of the Institute. Normally, this introduction would be done by our present presenter, but since he's presenting, he won't be giving the introduction. Instead, I will do that. Dan Kohanski has a lifelong interest in history, particularly European and American, a long career as a computer programmer, and a 5-year stint in the Foreign Service. His current historical interest is the development of Judaism and Christianity and how the ways in which they developed have had consequences for the world. Dan has a BA in philosophy from Colgate and an MS in computer science from Rutgers. His current book, A God of Our Invention, How Religion Shaped the Western World, was published in 2023 by Apocryphile Press, and I personally can vouch for it as being excellent and enlightening, very well written and very interesting subject, and presented very well. This presentation is based on, in large part, on chapter 6 of that book, When God Goes Off to War. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Dan.
Thank you, Jim, and welcome to the monthly presentation. I'm going to start right in because I'm trying to do this all in about 4,000 years of human history of war in about 45 minutes. So try to bear with me here. So let's go right to my screen. And there we go. So, topic is Judaism, Christianity, and war, or how these two religions changed, how the way they developed, how the way they evolved over time and got their ideas, theologies, how this changed the way we look at war. So I'm going to start, this is based on my book, which is, as Jim said, God of Our Invention. Mostly, not always, chapter 6, When God Goes Off to War. First off, we're not a nice species. In 5,000 years of human history, we've had maybe 300 years in which no conflict was recorded. That doesn't mean there was no conflict, which wasn't big enough to record. So that works out to about 95% of human history, some part of us has been at war. Particularly the ancient Near East, which is defined largely as the area in the Eastern Mediterranean up to about Persia, from about 3400 BC up to around the 1st century CE. We call that the ancient Near East. During that time, mostly somebody was at war with somebody else, big wars, small wars, all kinds of wars. So let's talk about the wars that the Bible talks about. What I call real wars, which are wars that the Bible records that actually happened. These are local wars and imperial wars. Then let's go mythical wars, and we'll see why I call them that later in a while. And there are two kinds of these. These are wars commanded by God, and the war between good and evil at the end of the world. Not just say right now, so I don't have to say it again. When I say the end of the world, that doesn't mean the world blows up or falls apart or the sun goes nova. It means the end of the world as we currently know it, return to God's kingdom, Garden of Eden, something along those lines. But everybody speaks of the end of the world, so I will. So we'll start with local wars. Here is the ancient Near East, and here is where the Israelites lived, particularly the northern kingdom of Israel, the capital of Samaria, southern kingdom of Judah, which was smaller, and its capital was in Jerusalem. So the Arameans went to war with the Israelites, and Israelites means both, Israel and Judah. Here are the Ammonites, here are the Moabites, here are the Edomites, and of course, here are the Philistines. These are all local kingdoms, local tribes, all going to war with each other from time to time over territory, over slaves, over economic reasons. There was always a constant low-level state of war going on, and Israel and Judah fought each other more than once. These are, wars that they're bad for the people who are involved in them, but they're not earth-shattering, so to speak. They're local, the tribal, they come and they go. But then you have imperial wars. And here's a map of the empires of the ancient Near East. There's Egypt, which was always there. The Hittites, which kind of went away about the time the Israelites show up around the 13th century BCE, but the map has them. So I put them in. Could everybody please mute themselves, please? Yeah. And then there's Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Mesopotamians included, for our purposes, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and the Babylonians the second time. There are also the Sumerians and the Hurrians and the Mitanni, but these are the major players during the period of time that we're talking about. And these empires used to attack each other. Here are the Hittites attacking Egypt. Here is Egypt attacking Mesopotamia. Here are the Babylonians and the Assyrians attacking Egypt. Notice where they all go through. They go through this stretch of land, which is called Palestine. It's really Canaan at the time. They do this because here you have the Arabian desert, which is kind of hard to go through, but here's the Fertile Crescent, so the armies can feed while they're marching, and they don't really have much in the way of ships, so they're going to go by land. This map will be more important several times, but let's just do it for right now. The point for the moment is that the kingdoms of Egypt and Judah, which were in the middle of all of this, all these armies, were vassals to either Egypt or mostly to the Mesopotamians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians. But in spite of the Bible making Israel and Judah important, these kingdoms were not important to the empires, except as a buffer, which meant if a vassal state failed to pay tribute or tried to rebel, whoever was ruling them at the time or overlord at the time would simply destroy it. And this is what happened to the northern kingdom of Israel. This is an actual bas-relief from Nineveh. I think it's Samaria, wasn't quite clear, but the Assyrians were incredibly efficient at waging war. And why did they go to war against the northern kingdom? Because according to the book of Kings, the king of Assyria found out that King Hosea of Israel was planning to change his allegiance to the king of Egypt. Similarly, Babylonians destroyed the southern kingdom. This is not an actual contemporary image, of course. This is somebody's representation. You can see the leaders being carried off to Babylon in 586 BCE. And the reason they did that, Zedekiah, the king of Judah, rebelled against the king of Babylonia. But in this case, something else happened that was very significant. They burned Yahweh's temple. Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, God of the Judahites, eventually becomes 𝘓𝘁, the only God, but we'll see that a little later on. So, in general, the Israelites looked at war, they looked at everything from a theological perspective. What are the theological implications of war? Well, the writers of the books of Judges, Samuel, and Kings, that's 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, according to them, the Israelites lost war when they turned away from Yahweh and worshipped other gods. If you look at the book of 2nd Kings, chapter 17, most of that chapter is a discussion of all the things that the northern kingdom of Israel did to make Yahweh angry. Not so much about morality, but because they wouldn't worship him. The prophets, however, did talk about morality. Amos talks about selling the needy for a pair of sandals, for example, mistreating the widow and the orphan. Isaiah does the same thing. So this is the reasons why, according to the prophets and according to the authors of Kings, the Israelites would lose war. But Yahweh let his own temple be destroyed. This becomes a big theological problem. Not supposed to happen. In other words, how could God have let the Babylonians destroy his very own temple, the house that he had built for the Israelites to worship him? Or put another way, Marduk, the Babylonian god, wasn't he more powerful than Yahweh? Well, in fact, Jeremiah claimed, in order to get out of this problem, that Nebuchadnezzar was actually Yahweh's servant. He says in Jeremiah King Nebuchadnezzar, my servant, my being God's. And he actually ordered the Babylonians to destroy Jerusalem because Manasseh, King Manasseh, who's reigned for about 54 years, who's the longest reigning king of Judah, and he set up idols in the temple. He set up idol worship all over the place. He allowed the worship of many gods. And by the way, he died 60 years before the destruction of Jerusalem. So this is kind of a looking for an explanation here. What it means from Jeremiah's point of view is that Yahweh was giving orders to Marduk. Israel's God did not allow it to happen. He ordered it to happen. And this will have major implications, not germane to this topic, but will have major implications for developing Israelite monotheism. If Yahweh controls the Babylonians, that means he's more powerful than Marduk. That means Marduk is a lesser god. Marduk is not a god at all. Yahweh rules everything. More to the point from my present topic, it solidified the idea that Yahweh used war to punish Israel for its sins. Manasseh had sinned against God. Yahweh sent the Babylonians to destroy the temple as punishment. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. Right now, I want to look at the first of what I call the mythical wars, which are wars commanded by God. Sorry, and there are two of these in the Bible. First one is the Amalekites. According to the book of Deuteronomy, when the Israelites were on their way into from Egypt to Canaan by way of Sinai, the Amalekites attacked them at their weakest point, which is back in the rear, when they had the weak and the injured. In other words, they were nasty. This actually also this also happens in Exodus, but there it's not quite as explicit that the Amalekites attacked the weakest part of the caravan. As a result, God commands Moses, it's a rather paradoxical commandment. You shall wipe out the remembrance of Amalek, you shall not forget. A little paradoxical there, but there it is. First of all, almost certainly didn't happen. For one thing, the Israelites didn't travel in any great numbers through Sinai from Egypt. If a few of them did, maybe 100 or a couple of thousand at most. We don't really know. We do know it never happened the way Exodus did. Also, the Amalekites were just another group of Canaanites, like the Hivites, the Hittites, and the Jebusites, and all the rest of them. Nothing particularly special. They may have been a little nastier than the others, but not. They were all kind of nasty from time to time, and exaggerated their nastiness. However, Amalek has become a label for the enemies of God. No mercy shall be shown. Haman was called an Amalekite. Hitler was compared to Amalek. Then the other God-commanded war in the Bible was Joshua. And this was a war. God commands Joshua and the Israelites take over the land of Canaan, kill, expel, or enslave everyone there. It's a war of annihilation, which they were put under the ban in Hebrew and in Moabite, the cherem, that they were to be completely wiped out. You don't even use their possessions. It never happened. And there are a lot of reasons why it never happened. I'll just cite one of them. During the entire period when the Exodus and the conquest could have happened, Egypt, as I'll show you shortly, maintained garrisons throughout Canaan. Some would say they ruled Canaan. I would say more they were like absentee landlords. They controlled Canaan, and they used it as a barrier against, as we saw earlier, the Hittites and the Mesopotamians. But they didn't rule it to the same extent that they ruled, say, Nubia. But they would not have allowed, they were not going to allow the Hittites or the Mesopotamians to come in. They certainly would not have allowed Joshua to do a conquest there. So, nonetheless, this becomes a model for a war of annihilation, commanded by God, which must be obeyed, no arguments. We'll see that showing up later on. Just as a side point, the rabbis didn't particularly like this idea, back then anyway. And in the Talmud, they said that this was a one-time event only against these 7 nations, specific nations mentioned in the book of Joshua, not to be repeated again. So, built on all of what we've seen so far, the Jewish theology of war, so to speak. The Jews are victorious in war when they worship Yahweh. The Jews are not so victorious in war when they don't worship Yahweh. If the Jews are bad enough, they not only lose the war, they get exiled, the Israelites and the Judahites. The point generally, Jewish theology of war. War is an instrument of divine reward and punishment. They get rewarded and they get punished. Now I want to look at the war between good and the other mythical war that I call the war between good and evil at the end of the world, and again, the end of the world as we know it. Now I want to go into just a little bit of general history about the 400-year period between the 2nd century BCE and the 2nd century CE. First thing is Antiochus IV, the Seleucid emperor, tried to stomp out the Jewish religion, probably only in Judea, not in the rest of his domains. This is the Maccabean revolt, which we now celebrate as Hanukkah. It's more complicated than they just stopped him, but they did cleanse the temple, and there was a truce, and things began to settle down. But the point is that this was a war. For the first time, Jews felt that their very existence as a Jewish nation, as the Jewish religion, was in danger of being exterminated, and they had to fight to stop it. Then, 100 years later, after the Hasmoneans had ruled Israel for a while, Judea for a while, Rome stepped in. There was a civil war between two Hasmonean brothers. They asked Rome to settle it for them. Rome settled it by coming in and taking over. And over time, between 63 BCE, when, among other things, Pompey walked into the Holy of Holies, which only the high priest could do, and only on Yom Kippur, he just walked right in. That's how Rome saw itself. So that's why I say it's as harsh in some ways as the rule of Antiochus. And Rome continued to rule Judea through, well, to about, well, we'll come to that later. It's about 400 or so. And there were several revolts against Rome. The Jews, particularly, they revolted against Rome in the what I call the Great Revolt, started in 66. The temple was destroyed in 70. The last gasp was in 73 when the Romans conquered Masada and discovered everybody had killed themselves. It was a huge revolt, and then the Jews tried it. So it was, again, a war between good and evil. The Essenes in particular described this as the war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. And they called the Romans were the sons of darkness in particular. Others also saw it this way. But then the Bar Kokhba revolt 50 years later, it's another revolt by the Jews against the Romans. That didn't work. After that, the rabbis generally said, okay, we're not going to do war for a while. We're just going to try and make the best of it as we can. So let's move on to the Christians, who are also living through the same set of wars. I want to highlight this. The end of the world, this is a basic function of Christianity, and I'm bolding it and coloring it because you cannot understand the history of Christianity, especially early, but even today, without understanding how important a role this one sentence plays in the entire Christian thinking. The end of the world was about to happen any moment. At the same time, in the first century, believers in Jesus were starting to feel that they were being persecuted. It's arguable how much they felt in that, but in any case, this is what they felt. And this began to lead some of them to think that there would be a war between God and Satan, an apocalyptic war. Why apocalyptic? Because of Revelation. Revelation in Greek is apocalypsis. That's all it means, really. It's just a divine revelation that has to be explained somehow. The actual word for the end of the world, in Greek, for the end of the world is eschaton. But everybody now understands apocalypse as meaning a violent end of the world. So therefore, it's an apocalyptic war. And it's an apocalyptic war because Revelation was a violent end of the world.
Okay. That's very nice. What's that?
Who's talking, please?
Edie, could you mute yourself?
What did you just do? You hit me hard.
Can you mute her, Jim?
Okay, I need to open up the, let's see.
I'm really trying to get through this as fast as I can.
No, yeah.
Hopefully not too fast.
Okay, here we go. There.
Okay. Book of Revelation, the strangest book in the Bible by a long shot. And it's got a lot of competition. It was probably written around 100 CE. It was not written by one of the apostles. It was written by John of Patmos. And he was, shall we say, crazy. He was writing particularly to 7 churches that were or thought they were experiencing persecution, and he was trying to give them some hope. The way he did it, his hope was he predicted that there'll be a final battle between good and evil, and not just the return of Jesus, the violent return of Jesus, and the establishment to establish God's kingdom on earth. And reading Revelation, it's you have to be very, don't read it while drinking anything, and don't read it while on any kind of drugs, because it will just drive you nuts. It's all about wrath and revenge. It's all very violent. It's battles all over the place. Later on, I'll come back to this point, Revelation is going to be the basis for the millennial belief in the coming apocalyptic war. Keep millennial and apocalyptic in mind. We'll talk about them later. Because we all know Revelation largely for the Battle of Armageddon. You see a demonic angel. I had a surfeit of pictures to pick from. This is one of the most popular themes in, well, anyway, one of the most popular themes in certain areas of Christianity, and they've got pictures and posters and everything all over the place. Why Armageddon? Revelation 16:16. They assembled the demonic armies in the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. So I want to go back to this map again. I showed it to you once before. All of the empires. Look where they're all going when they want to attack each other. Right there in the middle. Well, there's a choke point there. Mount Carmel, which is where Haifa is, comes right down to the sea, and it's a very big mountain.
Down.
That's right where the arrow point is. Edie, could you please mute? Thank you. And on the other side of Mount Carmel, there's about a 10-mile gap or so. There are the Judean hills. So not only do you have to go through this space on the Fertile Crescent to avoid going through the desert, you kind of squeeze to this choke point between Mount Carmel and the Judean hills. What's that choke point? It's called Megiddo in Hebrew, or sometimes Har Megiddo, Har meaning mountain, the mountain of Megiddo. In Greek transliteration, that's Armageddon. So hold that thought while we look at early Christian attitudes toward war. This is what they really thought, Revelation notwithstanding. First of all, there was the Pax Romana, with the Roman peace. Roman Empire controlled all the area where the early Christians lived. And while the Christians might have had of the Roman rulers from time to time, they didn't have to worry about all the wars that the Israelites went through in the ancient Near East. They didn't have to worry about their neighbors coming into and fighting over territory. They didn't have to worry about being in the middle of clashing empires. Rome enforced a harsh but very effective peace. Among other things, this meant that they could be pacifist. And they were, because in the Bible it says, "Thou shalt not kill." Actually, it says, "Thou shalt not murder," although the two words sometimes used to mean one or the other. Turn the other cheek. Jesus is very pacifist if you read his actual words. So early Christian fathers in the first, second and third centuries really did not want Christian believers joining the army. And the Romans thought they were cowards for doing so. So here's one of the main church fathers, Origen, or Origen, I never figured it out, in the 3rd century, around 275, "We do not indeed fight under the king, although he require it," meaning the emperor, "but we fight on his behalf, forming a special army, an army of piety, by offering our prayers to God." This is in response to the accusation that Christians are cowards because they won't join the army. Keep this one in mind. You'll see it coming up later. Nonetheless, a lot of Christians began joining the army. And they did serve in many different ways in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Now we have the Battle of Milvian Bridge. This is the Emperor Constantine, and he was fighting his co-emperor for control of the whole Roman Empire. Supposedly, the story goes, he saw a cross in the air the night before the battle, or he saw a group of swans, flying swans looked like a cross, and he heard a voice saying, "In hoc signo vinces," in this sign conquer. So he ordered his soldiers, again by the story, to put the 𝘖𝘯 on their shields. This is the Greek chi and rho, the first 2 letters of Christos, Christ, Messiah, Jesus. So they put them on the shields, and they won the battle, which he was the underdog, by the way. So it's not a total given. Claimed divine help, whether he actually believed it or not important. The point is that after Milvian Bridge, Constantine made Christianity a legally tolerated religion. And he got involved in Christianity. He called the Council of Nicaea. If you've heard of the Nicene Creed, this is where it comes from. He didn't allow, mainly what he was trying to do is establish a single Christian belief, which turned out to be the Nicene Creed, throughout his empire. 60 years later, his successor, Theodosius, made Christianity the official religion of the empire. What does this all mean in terms of war? The army is now Christian. In fact, you had to be Christian to join the army. Instead, Christians couldn't join the army. Now you had to be Christian if you wanted to join the army. Well, now you need a justification for war. The first 3 centuries, all these theologians have been saying we shouldn't fight a war. In fact, Origen even said that if the entire empire became Christian, there would be no more need for war because God would protect the empire. So we start off with the idea of just war, a war that is jus ad bellum, which is it means a war that is fought for just causes, and also jus in bello, a war that is fought by just means. This is Arnaud Blin, one of my sources. The just war doctrine implicitly posits that violence may be legitimate if it takes the form of a collective undertaking guided by a legitimate authority. This is Blin writing today, but that's the general idea of a just war. So we have Bishop Ambrose of Milan and his protege, Bishop Augustine, St. Augustine, devised a just war doctrine, the 2 of them together, and later Augustine in more detail worked out the idea of what is a just war. Here's an example. This is an unjust war, the desire to do harm, cruelty, and taking vengeance, a mind that is without peace. These are unjust. This is unjust war in action, jus in bellum. But in a just war is started because God or some legitimate authority, meaning the Roman emperor, goes to war against these people who are doing things unjustly. Put another way, this isn't a direct quote of Augustine, but it's kind of the idea. One must not wage war with passion, but with love. If that sounds unrealistic, it is. Here are a few observations about that. Concept of just war does go back to Cicero. However, Augustine and Ambrose wanted to give war a moral foundation so that without passion, but with love. On the other hand, they've never been soldiers. They didn't really understand what it means to be caught up in the middle of war. Augustine understood sex, and he understood passion in sex, but he didn't understand passion in war. Nevertheless, he came up with what he did. And to understand this, understand Augustine's concept of war, command of some legitimate authority. No legitimate authority gives you a command to kill when you're being attacked. They may say in general, but this is their understanding of killing in self-defense. It was not under the command of God or legitimate authority. You could run away, you could defend yourself, but no killing. That was how they thought about this. And there was an exception. Go back to Joshua's conquest, go back to Amalek. If God commands a war of annihilation, you have to do it. So between Augustine and the Crusades, things gradually develop. What do we have? The development of a feudal society. This is the breakdown of the overall Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is breaking down. Now you have individual feudal sections growing up. How does a feudal society operate? It operates under the command of men-at-arms, knights, barons, earls, kings, and they control it by their ability to kill people, by their military prowess on an individual level. Legitimate authority may be breaking up, may become more diverse, but the point is it's now small groups, not an overarching empire. They also have the disappearance of internal military enemies. There's no Sassanids, there's no large-scale pagan empires anymore. Scandinavia, by the 11th century, Scandinavia is about the only part of Europe that has not become converted to Christianity. On the other hand, there's an external enemy, Islam, which started off very militaristic. They had to fight to defend themselves. Muhammad was chased out of Mecca and had to flee to Medina because there was an army coming to kill him. He comes back 10 years later with an army of his own, takes over Mecca. So Islam has a different approach to war. I'm not going to get into it other than to say that. What you now have, though, is Islam attacking Christianity on an organized basis. The other thing you have is the peace of God. This is where the church tried to protect its own property from the various men-at-arms, barons, kings, and so forth, who might say, what? The church had a lot of extensive land. It's very wealthy. And so various people cast their eyes on it. Peace of God was meant to prevent that. Truce of God. This is something that comes along in the 9th century, more or less. Christians started killing each other because now you have a feudal society and they're trained to kill. They start using that. So you can't kill between Saturday night and Monday morning, and it gradually extended a little bit further. Couldn't kill other Christians anyway. The whole point of all of this, the church begins to see itself now as the arbiter of peace and war. It tells you when you can kill, it tells you when you can't, it tells you who you can kill, it tells you who you can't. In other words, we're shifting from just war to holy war. A just war is a war permitted by the church, a legitimate authority, command of God. A holy war, on the other hand, is a war commanded by the church. They're beginning to see themselves as having not only the arbiter when you're permitted to go to war, but when they want you to go to war. Probably the first example. In the 847, the Muslim raids are now threatening Italy. These were not conquest raids. These were just nuisance raids. Nonetheless, the Pope was getting very nervous because even a raid is pretty bad. So he wants the Christian powers to call for armed help. And what does he do? He writes to the army of the Franks, come help me, fight back against Italy, fight back against the Muslims who are threatening the Papal States, who are threatening Christian domains in Italy. And he says, if you die in these battles, which the church has now called, you will go directly to heaven. No matter what sins you have on your soul, you have died for the truth of the faith and the salvation of your soul. Lim thinks this is the first example. I have no reason to question him on it. This is the first instance where a pope promised salvation if you die in the name of the church. And of course, that brings us to the Crusades, which really is a Christian holy war. Let's talk about the First Crusade, which Urban II called for in 1095 at Clermont. We do not have a text of what he actually said. We have some guesses, which is a lot of historians have been very frustrated about that one. Nonetheless, it is fairly clear that he promised remission of sins at some point along the way. He called it a pilgrimage. These crusades will not actually be called crusades until about the year 1250. The Muslims call them the equivalent of what the Muslims called them at the time, they still call them today, but the Christians didn't call them crusades for 250 years, 150 years. So pilgrimage, they wanted to recover the holy city of Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, all the things that were so important that belonged to the church. And by the way, for most of the time that Jerusalem was under Muslim domination, up to this point, Christians could go on pilgrimage. They did it all the time. There were a few periods in the 11th century when they weren't allowed to, but they were very temporary. Generally speaking, if a Christian wanted to make a pilgrimage to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, he was free to do so. But the Pope wanted it back. He may have also wanted to stop Christians from fighting each other. There's some historical arguments about that. But mainly, he felt it necessary to call for a crusade, take back Jerusalem for Christianity. And he offered participants remission of sins. This really was a religious war. There's arguments about this. Definitely the later crusades were not all religious wars. The Fourth Crusade never even made it to the Muslim territory. The Venetians conned the Crusaders into attacking Constantinople, their economic rival. But the First Crusade, they really had religious fervor. Peter the Hermit led the People's Crusade. It was a fired up peasants, poor people. They had no idea what they were doing. They were slaughtered en masse because they had absolutely no idea how to fight. But they went to war in the name of the faith. Even the armed knights went to war because now they could get remission of sins and they wouldn't have to go to hell for the profession, which was killing people. When they actually conquered Jerusalem 3 years later, they went into a 3-day orgy of blood. They said the streets ran red with blood so high that it went up to their horses' necks. That's an exaggeration. That's actually paraphrasing a reference in Revelation. But the chroniclers who were writing about the massacre within the next few years, they justified it by references to the Joshua conquest, war of annihilation. God commanded it. So here we begin to see justification for actual war going back to a mythical war of Joshua. They may also have referenced Amalek, but I'm not so sure about that, so I left it out. Let's look at some other holy wars that took place in medieval times. Heresy and Inquisition. The Lateran Council, 1215, promised anybody stayed in Europe and who went after heretics, they would get remission of sins just as if they had gone on a crusade. The Inquisition, violence and torture against heretics. Although they didn't actually kill them, they turned them over to the secular authorities so the church shouldn't bloody its own hands. They got the princes to do it. The Albigensian Crusade, a group of Cathars in southern France, primarily around the town of Albi, near Carcassonne. They had very strange ideas. This is where the troubadours come from. Mainly, though, they didn't accept the authority of the Pope, and the Pope was Innocent III at the time, probably the single most powerful Pope in the history of the popes. He didn't like that idea. So he ordered a crusade. No, they didn't call it that then, but he ordered an attack against the Cathars in and around Albi. This is where you get the famous line, "Kill them all, God will know his own." That was not actually meant literally. It was meant to terrify the people who might have supported the Cathars and convince them, if you go on the side of the Cathars, you're going to be slaughtered. It was a military tactic, not a religious one, but it's one of the famous lines that comes from that crusade. And it really also was a religious war, at least on the part of the Cathars, because at the end of it, it lasted until 1244, it started in 1208. At the end of it, in the siege of Montségur, the surviving Cathars were offered their lives if they would give up their heresy and accept the Catholic Christianity. They all refused and were burned at the stake. So for them, it was a religious war. France's wars of religion, this is after Luther, when you have the Huguenots, and the Huguenots and the Catholics fought each other largely over, I should say, who had the keys to the kingdom of heaven. The end of it, Henry Navarre was a Protestant, was the last surviving lord. He agreed to convert to Catholicism, and with the famous, possibly apocryphal line, Paris is well worth a mass. So he converted. Then he, in 1598, he issued the Edict of Nancy, which ordered toleration of the Huguenots, and for that a monk assassinated him in 1610. So he may have settled the war, but not really. And of course, the 30 Years' War between Catholics and Protestants all over Europe, it did really start out as a religious war when Ferdinand of Bohemia ordered it was King Ferdinand, who later became Holy Roman Emperor. He was a very fervent Catholic, and he ordered the Protestants in Prague to give it up. He sent his messengers there. They threw them out the window. So the defenestration of Prague. And they survived the fall. When I was in Prague, they said it was because the king's officials landed in a dung heap or shit pile. At any rate, that started the 30 Years' War, which really destroyed Europe. It was the most devastating war until World War I, maybe even worse than World War I, not as bad as World War II. Germany was wiped out. At the end of the 30 years, they agreed to meet. It took them 7 years, from 1641 to 1648, to come to a final resolution. And the Catholics and the Protestants met 30 miles apart. And they finally settled the Peace of Westphalia, which said, okay, we'll tolerate people. That is probably the first time since Roman times that ruling parties agreed to tolerate minority religions. And there's a Pequot massacre. I'm using this one as an example. This is in Puritan, Massachusetts. In 1637, a group of Puritan soldiers attacked a Pequot Indian camp, probably around what's now Northampton. Why? It's a complicated story. The Indians, Native Americans, and the Puritans had an uneasy relationship from the beginning. The Puritans felt they had been attacked, they were attacking. It doesn't matter too much. What matters is this. John Underhill, who was the second in command of the Puritan forces that attacked the Puritans, explained it, why they did so. Sometimes the scripture declareth women and children must perish with their parents. Sounds like the Amalekites, sounds like Joshua. Didn't say that specifically, but he said, we had sufficient light from the word of God for our proceedings. He calls King David's war, but I don't know what he's referring to, because there were a lot of wars, but David didn't really usually fight that way, but he cites that without further justification. More quotes from Puritan, Massachusetts. Increase Mather, major Puritan theologian. King Philip's War was a war between Melanchthon, who was the leader of a large group of Indians, again in central Massachusetts. Again, not important why they went to war, just there was a war. It's one of those things where everybody says they started it first. But here's what Increase Mather had to say. God hath let us see that he could have easily destroyed us by such a contemptible enemy as the Indians have been in our eyes. Yea, he hath convinced us that we ourselves could not subdue them, so that we have no cause for glory, for it is God that which hath saved us, and that we are so. This is going right back to the Jewish theology of war that I talked about before. War is an instrument of divine reward and punishment, in this case, divine reward. A few years later, Cotton Mather, son of Increase Mather, he delivers a sermon, soldiers counseled and comforted. This is one of those 4-hour sermons they like to give. So I'm not going to quote even this whole passage, but read the one point. We will keep in the mount with our hands lifted up the way Moses did at the battle with the Amalekites in Exodus. While you are in the field with your lives in your hands against the Amalek, that is, the talking calls the Indians Amalek. I talked to a couple of scholars about this who are looking for other references. There are a few more references to Joshua in American history. This may be the only reference to Amalek, but it is a reference in American thinking. Oh, yeah, I'm running behind as I thought I would. I do want to touch on this last topic. I'm going to try to go through it quickly because it's important for the present day. Millennialism and war. This is now going back to the book of Revelation. Millennialism today it's based on the passage in the book of Revelations. The martyrs will be priests of God, reign for 1,000 years. There's several references to 1,000 years in Revelation. But millennialism means a period of 1,000 years where Jesus is reigning on earth before the final judgment. During the Middle Ages, there was a lot of millennial thinking, 𝘖𝘶𝘳𝘓𝘓𝘓, all kinds of other. The church always tried to stop it. By around the time 1500, 1600, they had pretty much tamped it out. Then along comes Luther, who, among many other things, says he believes the world will end in 1600. He died in 1547, so he didn't get a chance to find out he was wrong. But you'll find where the Catholics mostly are what we call now amillennialists. That is, it's going to happen sometime, or maybe we're already even in it. A lot of Protestants, not all, Episcopals, Methodists, Lutherans, they're kind of amillennials. Evangelicals and fundamentalists and other forms, charismatics, tend to be millennialists. And so, especially since the fundamentalists were an offshoot of the evangelicals since about 1900. You have post-millennialism, which means first we establish the kingdom of God on earth as an earthly kingdom. After we've done that for 1,000 years, Jesus comes back afterwards, hence post-millennialism. During the colonial period, this is true, they were trying to establish the kingdom of God on earth, the new Israel, the new Jerusalem. You'll hear this talk among the Puritans a great deal. In Puritan New England, it's all Canaan, New Jerusalem, city on a hill. That's all post-millennialist thinking. Mid-19th century, it begins to shift, not just because of the Civil War, but a lot of it because of the Civil War. Now the thinking is more premillennialism. Jesus comes back first. This is a supernatural event. Post-millennium doesn't have to have one until actually Jesus comes back. After the 1,000 years, premillennialism, Jesus comes back before the 1,000 years. Now, why is this important to the topic of war? Because when Jesus comes back as a premillennialist, he goes to war. The book of Revelation's war. It's the 7 years of tribulation war. The dispensationalists who will escape. You've seen the pictures of the faithful rising up to heaven to escape all the war that's going to happen on earth at Armageddon. So this thinking shows up in the Civil War's apocalypse. Here's a quote from the book of Revelation. The sharp sword, he will tread the winepress. If this sounds familiar, that's because it's the battle hymn of the Republic. He is trampling out the vineyard with the grapes of wrath stored. He has loosed the faithful lightning of his terrible sword. This is extremely apocalyptic and deliberately so. Focus, book of Revelation. Here's another one. Frederick Douglass. I'm amazed at how incredible an orator he was. Men have a choice in this world. They can be angels or they can be demons. In the apocalyptic vision of Revelation that John describes a war in heaven, this is what we're fighting now in the Civil War. The appalling darkness of human suffering and selfishness and sin. And then he quotes John Milton. The slaveholders had rather reign in hell than serve in heaven. The South had the same idea from their perspective. Benjamin Palmer, one of the more important preachers in the South, great struggle, we defend the cause of God and religion. The abolitionist spirit has now seated its high priest. That was Lincoln. This is just after Lincoln was elected. It's selected for its victim, as us for its victims and slavery for its issue. Here's more modern thinking, John Hagee, who is majorly involved in politics and who is the Christians United for Israel is another organization, what they call Christian Zionists, who are very much supporting Israel, especially right now, what things are going on. Quotes from Revelation 16:14. Satan, his chief son, the Antichrist, calls for every nation to send their armies to Israel. Now he's after China. Sometimes he's after Russia. In this quote, he's after China. The armies will gather for the battle at Armageddon or Armageddon. Why is the founder of the Christians United for Israel so interested in Armageddon? Look back at our map again. Where is Armageddon? In Israel. So that's where the final battle will be fought. All right, some final thoughts. I'm not doing too badly here. This is a summation. It's a bit of a caricature. It's a lot of, it's surface. There's a lot of detail underneath it. You'll dig for it. It's just, take it as reasonably accurate for descriptive purposes. War is punishment by religion. The Israelites were punished when they misbehaved. War is preserving religion. This is the Maccabean War. This is the Bar Kokhba revolt, the great revolt against the Romans. War is forbidden by religion. The early Christians were pacifists. War is justified by religion. The just war of Augustine. War is mandated by religion. The Crusades and the Inquisition. War is predicted by religion. Premillennialists mainly. Postmillennialists sometimes. Premillennialists always. And summing it up, this is the critical point that all of this leads up to. Christianity in the world today acts as a force multiplier of war on two factors: divine approval, God approves it, God commands it, even God permits it. And as we saw, starting with Pope Leo and continuing through the Crusades and in some of the militant Protestants today, if you die in battle, fighting for God, you are promised reward in heaven. Finally, here's a list of all kinds of things that a bare scratching of the huge library of stuff on this material. I'll leave it up there for a few minutes, and of course, it will be up for on the YouTube recording. So, discussion.
Well, thank you, Dan, and perhaps we should leave it up for a minute, and then we'll move back to not staring the screen so we can.
Okay, I'll stop the screen sharing.
Right, so we can see everyone.
No, that's uncaring. I want to stop share. There we go.
Okay. And everyone will have to unmute before you speak.
I had to go a little fast, and even as it was, I took longer than I should have.
No, that was you have so much material there, Dan. It's amazing that you were able to be so concise. Let's see. All right. So, let's see. I had one small point. At one point, you said that the Hittites were Canaanites. Is that true?
No, I did not say that. The Hittites attacked the Canaanites.
But I thought that was just a slip of the tongue.
But what I actually want to say was the Hittites' empire more or less ended around the 13th century BCE, and we don't really see the Israelites before that time. I left it because it was there on the map that I used, and because the Hittites did attack Egypt, again, using that same Fertile Crescent route. It's possible, I've had some discussion, it's possible that the Israelites indirectly influenced the Israelites on some theological points, but it was indirect. But they were an empire, and they were there.
I can see a strong explanation or background here of the Christian participation in the wars of today here. It would be wonderful if you were to go on and at one point you just mentioned that you weren't going to discuss the Muslim point of view, and then we have, of course, the Israel of today, and to the extent that they're carrying on or elaborating on Jewish theory of war, would be very interesting to hear what you had to say about that.
I really want to go heavy into it. I can't stand Netanyahu. He's in it for himself. he started this whole thing. He funded Hamas, he ignored Hamas, and now he's fighting Hamas as a way of keeping out having to go on trial for corruption charges.
Right.
But we're not supposed to get into politics on this website, on
Right.
this forum. So
Sure.
let me just say this, though. Mayor Kohanski, who founded the Koch Party and who was very militant Zionist, he wanted to see all of the Arabs driven out of the land of Israel, the whole land, the old ancient land of Canaan. His two favorite books in the Bible were Joshua and Ezekiel. And that tells you something right there.
Yeah. And but as I understand it, I mean the Israeli public is generally and very much in favor of the Jewish the Israeli army's actions in Gaza, and the settler, quote unquote, movement in the West Bank, uses the God's commandment to Joshua sometimes to justify with their actions.
The settlers do that, yes. I don't know I don't think you can really say that Israel's always supporting what the war. There's too many variations. There's too many arguments going on. There are huge demonstrations against the war going on a lot in Tel Aviv. As is everything else in Israel, there's always 2 Jews, 3 opinions. With the 7 million Jews, so multiply that. Work it out in your head. It's somewhere astronomical figure.
Right. And of course, the Muslim history of war and reaction to the Crusades and war against them and so forth. There's lots and lots of complexity to that as well.
Well, all right. I can talk a little bit about the Muslim Islamic theory of war. And Islam divides the world into 2 groups: Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam, and Dar al-Harb, which can be translated as the House of War. But they don't see it necessarily as continual war. The original Islamic theory did not allow Muslim rulers to make peace with non-Muslims, but they could make a truce. And originally a truce could only be 10 years. Now it could be indefinite. And eventually, as happened with all new religions, their initial fervor died out, and they started consolidating, and so they expanded very rapidly. One reason they did so in the beginning is that Arab mercenaries used to hire out to both the Roman emperors and the Sassanid emperors, because we were fighting each other. The Sassanids are in what's now Persia and Iraq, which meant, among other things, that not only were they very experienced fighters, they knew the weaknesses of both empires. So when they started out under Muhammad for the first 10 years of Islam, they started out as a conquering tribe. They knew what they were doing. By the time they got to Spain, that's a little far and getting a little tenuous. Christians like to talk about the Battle of Roncesvalles when the Muslims moved into France over the Pyrenees as a battle that saved Europe from becoming Muslim. It was not. It was an expeditionary force. They were just poking around. By that time, the initial fervor had worn off. But they did poke around, and there were long periods, centuries of cooperation, centuries of peace. It goes back and forth. But Islam doesn't quite see war the same way as Christians and Jews do. And I think I'll leave it at that, because it has as many variations as both Judaism and Christianity.
Yeah, enough for a second book, perhaps. Yeah.
Not by me. I don't read Arabic.
Oh, okay. So, anyone else have any observations or questions? Please.
Just an observation. In that depiction, the menorah, did that come about during the Maccabean revolt?
Oh, that was just an artist's description. There was a menorah in the temple, 7 branches, of course. The 9-branch menorah just means candelabra.
That's what I thought. I just saw a menorah in some guy.
It was a seven branch. It's described in the book of Exodus. It's a big thing. When you think of a menorah and you think of it with Hanukkah, that's 9 branches, 9 candles. That's not, that's a secondary thing. The 7 branches is the old menorah is described in Exodus and is one of the symbols of the Israelite and Jewish religion.
So it would go back to 580.
It would go back
Okay.
to the first temple time, yes.
Great presentation on 𝘏𝘯𝘥. I mean, really fascinating. Thanks.
No, thank you. I left everybody speechless. Okay.
That's hard to imagine with this group that you've left everyone speechless, but perhaps
I'll just say one last thing, that I read Dan's book and it's worth getting and reading. I highly recommend it. So
I'm sorry, John.
I read your book and I'm recommending it. It's excellent.
Oh, thank you.
and as I said at the beginning, I just felt the same way. I thought it was very cogent. It's succinct. I mean, there's a subject where you could go on, and some have for long tomes, but Dan, as good example in this presentation, is a very talent for taking complex subjects and putting them forward in a cogent and succinct and enlightening way. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, next month will be Esther Marat will be talking about the blood libel, Norwich. She lives near there.
Right.
Sending a note out in about 5 days, July 21st.
Okay, last call for any questions. Otherwise, I will stop the recording and call it a month.
Okay.
Okay.